Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so very much for tuning into the show this week. Hello, and how are you, E.C.?
Great. How are you doing?
Wondrous. We're going to talk about sodium today. In your notes that you sent me always before this episode, I'm pretty sure you titled the note, "You're Drowning in Sodium."
Yeah.
Maybe we'll use this as the title, but it did make me laugh when you sent it over. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about why most people consume far more sodium than they need and where it's coming from, how high sodium diets affect your blood pressure and overall health, and who really needs electrolytes to stay hydrated. Cool? So let's do a little bit of background. We've certainly talked about sodium in the past. Let's do a little background. Let's get into this, though.
Yeah. Definitely we've hit it pretty hard over the years. Of course, some of these things are older, but hopefully this one definitely has a little bit more of the highlights, practical application type stuff in it than all of the really deep dive science. But I think, we're back in the summer months, and so the hydration market is alive and well. Heaven forbid we sweat without any full replenishment, So that's why I want to talk about it again. And I'm going to tell everyone out of the gates that it's far more likely they need more water than they need more sodium to, quote, stay hydrated, but you might not even need as much water as the hydration marketing would like you to believe. I just checked out the FDA website again to make sure my stats are up to date. We're consuming in the U.S. on average 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day, and the recommended upper limit is 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. So basically we're 50% over what we need. And we have to remember that most people aren't even exercising enough where we would theoretically sweat out some of this excess sodium. Now, again, I know our audience is the much more active demographic than the general population. And so they're probably like, yeah, but EC, we actually do sweat. I hear you. So do I. But it has to be sweating for a long enough duration. And so I like to give this kind of cutoff or general guideline of high intensity, continuous sweating for at least 90 minutes that we would think about kind of electrolyte supplementation. So a lot of my audience, including myself, people that are kind of the functional fitness, short, AMRAPs, all that stuff, it's not going to be relevant for us. And so sodium is one of these things that I think it's either overlooked or people over-index on it, with all of the marketing out there about staying hydrated and what you need. And before we get into it, one more kind of nuance I want to point out to people that sodium is not the same thing as salt. So when we hear the word salt or table salt, that's a combination of both the sodium and the chloride molecule. Those molecules don't weigh the same. So it's about 40%, because they don't weigh the same. About 40% of the weight out of your salt shaker would actually be the sodium molecule. But it's very easy to get concerned of, oh my gosh, I'm having way too much, if you start getting confused about when people are talking about salt versus sodium in foods and stuff like that. So it is good to kind of stay keyed into, right now I just gave the sodium limits, and we're going to focus on sodium numbers in foods.
Got it. Okay, so the sodium, we're consuming about 50% too much sodium. Where is that extra 50% coming from? Because I imagine it's not all directly related to really good marketing.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, most people that are over consuming sodium aren't doing it by way of electrolyte packets, although I think that's probably a nuance in our community. But yeah, I mean, no surprise here. Most of our excess sodium is coming by way of processed food and or restaurant and takeout food. I even saw some stat in a paper that in just one restaurant meal alone, you could hit that 2,300 milligrams per day limit. So I've seen different stats. Upwards of 70 to 80% of our sodium intake comes from either processed or restaurant food sources. It's not really coming from your salt shaker, making meals at home. And I think that's probably when people think I need to cut back on salt, probably the first thing they think about is the salt shaker, not these other sources.
Yeah, it's the salt that I'm actually putting into the food versus the salt that's already in
When in reality, that's a small fraction. From the American Heart Association, the top 10 sources of food that contain sodium are like bread and rolls, pizza, sandwiches, cold cuts or deli meats, soups, burritos and tacos, snacks, poultry, cheese, and then egg dishes and omelets. And so a lot of those, I think, when you hear them, especially, again, our audience is like, well, I probably don't do a ton of, the pizza and the sandwiches type stuff. But interestingly enough, and we just got through this section kind of in my app group on the 3 pillars method, and I've heard this before with my clients in the master classes, I have a lot of people that are doing the whole food thing, and they come to learn that their sodium is still high. And so they might have this good base of fruits, veggies, and protein, and yet they're still over the 2,300 milligram limit. And it's because processed foods, not even like packaged snacks processed foods, but processed foods that are meant to be healthy often are very high in sodium. And so here's a couple examples. Cottage cheese, the food that I feel like people think can do no wrong. There's a very delicious brand out there. And a single serving, it's 80 calories and 14 grams of protein. So that's like a dream in terms of low calorie, high protein. I mean, that's like, oh my gosh, sign me up, right? But in that one serving, you're getting 340 milligrams of sodium. And so I wanted to do this example of like, let's look at the calories to sodium that you're getting. If you were to eat 2,000 calories a day, you could end up doing 25 of these servings of cottage cheese to get all the way up to 2,000 calories consumed, but you would only get 7 servings to hit that sodium limit of 2,300 milligrams per day. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm never going to eat, 7 servings of cottage cheese, or I'm never going to eat even 25 servings of cottage cheese. That's not really the point of what I'm trying to illustrate. I'm trying to illustrate that you could use a food that has such great number or low number of calories, but yet the sodium is adding up much faster than you would anticipate, right? So another example, there's a popular brand of beef jerky. You can get 10 grams of protein from it per every 100 calories. But in that single serving, there are 380 milligrams of sodium. So same thing there. You could do 20 servings of it to only consume 2,000 calories, but just 6 servings to hit your limit of sodium. Here's, I think, like just like an incredibly shocking one, and it might not be super relevant in the summer, but I've caught myself a few times with soup. This was a popular organic tomato soup brand. 1 cup of it only has 100 calories, yet it has 670 milligrams of sodium. So again, it would take 20 servings to hit 2,000 calories, but just 3.4 servings to hit that sodium limit. Now, of course, any food can be part of a healthy diet. If you just have this 1 cup of tomato soup and then the rest of the day really doesn't have anything packaged, just fruits and veggies, just whole food protein sources that don't come pre-cooked or pre-seasons or all that stuff, you might be just fine on sodium. But the point here is a lot of us do have these somewhat packaged, although not ultra processed foods. And so it's going to be very easy to be quite high in sodium, even when other aspects of your diet are doing quite well, like calories and protein that are obviously central to the 3 pillars method.
We've talked a lot, obviously we've talked a lot about protein. We've talked a lot about calories. One of the things we don't talk a lot about is whether it's flipping the label over and actually looking at that, how much sodium is in there. And so I just bring that up to say, like, how is that the simplest way to begin to assess how much sodium we're actually getting? And if we're on that negative side of that 50% too much sodium, is it just simply beginning to look at the sodium count as well as all the other things that we look at when we look at a label?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you can definitely do it the old-fashioned way. Just flip it over, use your pen and paper and a Post-it, and kind of tally as you go. I'm sure half the listeners at least are, oh my gosh, woman, like stop with the Post-its and let's move into the digital era. But yeah, that's the simple way to do it, and that would be a great way to just get a really rough assessment of where you are. And you can even start with just like, hey, anything that's, comes with a nutrition label, I'm just going to start there and see where I fall, and you're probably going to be pretty close. Of course, apps do this just as well, MyFitnessPal, but my app, 3 Pillars Method, does it. And I think it's a great way to see what your sodium intake is, even if you aren't necessarily committing to weighing and measuring everything forever. You just take a really representative, this is a typical day for me, and see where you fall. Now, what's interesting about using an app for tracking, it's actually going to be a little bit low, probably to what your true consumption is, because we're not actually accounting for what is coming out of your salt shaker, as we mentioned. And we also have to be really fastidious or keyed in when we're tracking that we want to look at things like the electrolyte packets, of course, or even some flavored water packets that you might add that aren't necessarily advertised as electrolytes, because you'd be surprised that those items also have more sodium than you thought in it. For example, I was poking around my kitchen to try to find some different examples, and I have a lemon flavor that I add to water. It's only got 10 calories, so it's very easy to think, this has nothing in it. It's not a, quote, electrolyte packet, but it has 70 milligrams of sodium. So again, the ratio percentage of sodium that I'm getting is much higher than the amount of calories I'm getting. And so all of this stuff really starts to add up. And so I think it is really useful for people just to take a day, go through it either on an app or whatever, back of the envelope calculation to see where they fall. Another way that if people are like, okay, I'm not even interested in doing a full day assessment, though, is I think a very general kind of rule of thumb people can use is you want to be very, very cautious on items where the sodium milligrams are higher than the calories per serving. So that cottage cheese example, 340 milligrams of sodium, 80 calories. The soup example, 670 milligrams of sodium, 100 calories. Now, again, that won't put together the whole day for you, but if you have a few of those items in your diet where the sodium is much, much higher than the calories, it's almost going to be a given that you're going to be over the sodium target.
Let's talk a little bit about the adverse effects of too much sodium, and maybe start with blood pressure. What is the relationship or the cause and effect between sodium and blood pressure?
Yeah, that's the most kind of well-known one, documented one. I will say it is still subject to some genetic variation, shocker, that not everybody has that. But typically, I would say more often than not, we see when people increase their sodium in their diet, their blood pressure goes up. So blood pressure is the pressure or the force of the blood on the arteries or the vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. And how much physical pressure the blood is pushing on the walls is going to be measured in terms of millimeters of mercury. And we give blood pressure out in terms of a ratio between the pressure on the arteries when the heart beats and then the pressure on the arteries between beats. And so it's a higher number over a lower number. It's the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. And normal is considered something like 120 over 80. And then hypertension or high blood pressure is, of course, when it's higher, like 130 over 80. And of course, it can get much worse than that. Now, the problem with this high blood pressure is that your heart has to generate that force. And why sodium will typically increase blood pressure is because sodium tends to increase the water retention in the body. So I know this is like really simple, so some of like a nephrologist is probably going to be cringing a little bit, but here we go. You want to think about it as your body tries to maintain a certain concentration of electrolytes like sodium in the blood. And so the more you eat sodium, that sodium concentration is going to increase in your blood. And so to maintain the right concentration, the body has to retain more water to effectively dilute the sodium concentration that you eat. So we bring that concentration back down. And the kidneys really are exquisite in their balance to do that. They'll either retain more water so we don't urinate as much to help keep the concentration correctly, or maybe it'll remove more sodium in your urine so that the concentration stays correctly, and that's really their role. And so again, excess sodium, we tend to retain more water. More water means there's a greater volume of blood to push, and therefore there needs to be greater pressure of the heart to generate to push that greater volume through the arteries. And then there's lots of problems with that. One being heart failure. Of course, thankfully, this doesn't happen overnight, but it's just the heart muscle cannot keep up with all the force that it has to generate. Another one is that higher blood pressure on the walls of the arteries can actually damage them, again, over a longer period of time. But you start to damage the inner lining of the blood vessels. This can develop into plaque. This is then how we can start to have a clog where, voila, we have a heart attack because the blood cannot get through the vessel.
What other adverse effects are there or could there be? Like if I don't have high blood pressure, should I be worried about my sodium intake, or is it only under the conditions that, okay, I have high blood pressure, I need to be paying extra attention to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one of those things. It's like, oh, well, if I don't, like you said, if I don't have high blood pressure, then, oh, well, my sodium's high, fine enough. And it doesn't seem to be that way, that there are these independent effects of having high salt in the diet, even if your blood pressure is still good or within normal. It seems to affect organs directly, like the heart, kidney, skin, brain, and even the blood vessels, again, independent of the blood pressure being high. So just the high salt itself, even though it might not affect the water retention in the body, the high salt itself can damage the lining of the blood vessels, and therefore over time that will make them more stiff. And then once the blood vessels are more stiff, guess what? We need more pressure to get the blood through them. And so this is interesting in that, like, the blood pressure might end up going up because of salt in the diet, although it didn't start with the same mechanism. It didn't start with having more water volume there. It simply started because the salt damage directly to the blood vessels themselves then impacted their functionality and then caused the blood pressure to go up. Another thing that we think salt affects is, like, for example, skin, and how high sodium can actually impact collagen production. So everyone's so worried about having their collagen supplement for their skin and hair and nails. And it's like, well, what about if we reduce sodium? And so we better produce collagen in the body. Or even bone. Higher salt intakes may increase calcium excretion, which then might increase the risk of osteoporosis. So again, we might be so focused on, am I getting enough calcium in my diet for, good bone health? But in reality, maybe we'd be better off by cutting back on sodium. And so we do have a lot of other things to think about. I don't want to go through them all, but we also have to think about the fact that some of these higher risks with higher sodium might just be because a lot of our sodium is coming from processed foods. So there's things even like you have an increased risk of gastric cancer or stomach cancer when you have a high sodium diet. Now, we do have some mechanisms that we can kind of point to and think this might be the reason why the salt is causing that increased risk, but it also might be a byproduct of the fact that our high sodium foods don't have any really good nutrients in them, and they tend to be in excess of calories, which we've talked about once or twice before. And so it's like, is the problem of the high salt really because of the salt specifically, or because the way we get it are these processed foods that have a lack of other nutrients we need? And I would probably guess that it's going to be a little bit of both, right? That sometimes it's just the salt causing the problem, and sometimes it's just that we're overeating processed foods. Now, I do want to add on a little bit more here about the literature because it's kind of all over the place. I'm sure some people have seen various influencers, especially in our sphere, promoting high salt diets, maybe by way of electrolyte supplementation. And some, for example, will even suggest that, studies show the optimal range to minimize, let's say, cardiovascular events would be to have your sodium in the 3,000 to 5,000 milligrams per day range, which of course is higher than the 2,300 limit I suggest.
Yep.
This confusion in the literature about sodium is kind of related to how we measure sodium. Of course, there are sodium intake. There's lots of ways to do it. You could just take a urine sample at one point in the day and then try to use that to extrapolate and assess what you think the person's intake would be. Of course, that's going to be not accurate at all, right? Because that could change wildly across the course of the day. Mm-hmm. The gold standard is to take a 24-hour measurement, where that would be to collect all of somebody's urine across 24 hours. And that would help us better assess what their intake is across the day, because again, of this fluctuating work by the kidneys to maintain sodium concentration. What we found, and this is the Lurchel paper in the show notes, that even one day is not accurate enough. That to be able to predict someone's salt intake to about an accuracy of 92% based off of urine collection, they needed 7 consecutive days. Not one, 7 consecutive days of somebody collecting all of their urine for each of those days. And so let me tell you what they're not doing in very large population studies. That they're not going to have this huge thousands of people collect urine for let alone one day, but 7 days and bring it to the lab to be analyzed. Yet that's how we really can assess accuracy of sodium intake. And I went through all of that because it's like, that's why you're going to see all of this back and forth in the literature about, okay, high salt diet is good or high or low salt diet is better. And some of it's going to just simply because the way that we measure sodium really it hasn't been that accurate. And so for me, where I kind of, I guess, take comfort in, or why I land on the lower end of things and why I don't push the higher recommended levels that you'll see on social media, is because if 70 to 80% of our sodium intake is coming from processed food, to me, that just sort of speaks to the changes in our modern food environment, which we really didn't need as a species. Like if high salt was so necessary and so optimal, then why did it just become a thing in 1970? And how the heck did we get to 1970 before then, right? And of course, we know that our ancestor populations tended to be more active on average, and they tended probably to sweat more on average simply because they didn't have climate control everything. So to me, it sort of is like, yeah, I think that it's more an artifact of our processed food, and that it would be more health protective to land on the lower end of this, and then understand that some of the discrepancies in the literature are more because of a lack of accuracy of the measurement of salt intake than necessarily really showing us that that's where it's more optimal to be.
Is there a reason that the testing is done with a urine sample and not on the front end.
Oh,
In other words, tracking or measuring sodium intake by tracking food, and not, is it just that more people will pee in a cup than they will log their food?
great question. No, they do that as well, but that is going to be even more inaccurate than the pee in a cup because we'll end up losing more by way of urine, and so we can get a better assessment. We've talked about before the fact that people don't do so great recording their food.
Yeah.
And so the pee in a cup actually will be more accurate than the recording of the food. But that study that I said that they needed the 7 consecutive days to get within 92% accuracy, that's a study where they actually controlled their intake, said, take this much, and we're going to collect the urine. And now we're going to see how they actually line up. And they needed the 7 days to get the best kind of corroboration between the two. Yeah.
Oh, got it. So because they knew the intake
Yep.
and they knew, got it. Then that's how they could figure it out.
Yeah, and that's how they figured out that the 7 days was really necessary.
Fascinating. Okay. So we've talked about electrolytes a little bit. You did mention at the top, like, unless you fit into this kind of category, I think you said 90 minutes of continuous, relatively high intensity exercise, you might not. But like, can we get a little bit more granular into that? Like, who actually might need electrolyte supplementation, and what does a hydration strategy look like?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's this general notion out there that you need the electrolyte packets to become hydrated or stay hydrated. Basically, like this notion that your body won't just absorb plain water to become hydrated. And that's just silly. Thankfully, we would be really in a problem if that didn't work, if drinking water didn't make us more hydrated. Now, there's many electrolytes, but the primary one is sodium. And you already have, again, sodium in the body from food and from meals over the past hours. Like, the system is really beautiful and elegant, but it doesn't adjust just instantaneously every second. And now you're back to exactly one concentration. It happens over hours, right? The kidneys are just kind of reassessing this and either retaining more water or getting rid of more sodium, right? But for most people, because we have this kind of baseline level of sodium in the diet from prior meals, your best guidance going forward for hydration is just drink to thirst. You end up getting thirsty around 1 to 2% dehydration, which is a fine, safe enough level to be, quote, dehydrated. You're not really risk of anything. You will get thirsty. And basically, when you drink, you refill that water volume that was lost, maybe by breathing out or by sweating or using the restroom or something like that. And that's how you just kind of maintain the right concentration of sodium, which, again, generally on average, most of us are already over where we need to be. So we're probably kind of maintaining a higher water volume than we need to. We're just retaining more water because the sodium coming in is pretty darn high. And you're going to know if you're drinking enough water, not based on some multiple day challenge, not based on these crazy recommendations of drink a gallon a day or whatever it is. You're going to know if you're drinking enough water if you're drinking to thirst, and then your urine is pale yellow. Doesn't have to be clear. You don't have to necessarily measure it based on liters. It's drink to thirst and your urine is pale yellow. That's going to be your best, most accurate way to do it. Now, in terms of electrolytes, who needs that? Again, not a lot of people. I think the misconception is that we lose a lot of electrolytes or sodium in sweat. We do lose some, but we don't lose that much. When we sweat, most of that sweat is actually water, and a small fraction of it is the electrolytes, including sodium. And so this is why I'm so adamant about this guideline of continuous sweating for 90 minutes or longer multiple times a week to really start to be in the ballpark of I might be somebody who needs sodium supplementation, because it's at that duration and volume where now you've potentially lost enough, not just water, but also sodium. Like if you just sweat for 20 minutes, you really haven't lost sodium via sweat. You've just lost some water. And that's going to be kind of most, again, of our audience, and why I think the overwhelming majority of people listening to this can just drink to thirst even when they're regular exercisers and regularly sweating. Okay, so I think for most people, the guidance here is, first of all, just do a quick assessment of what your sodium intake is. I think many people will be surprised to learn that they're already over where they should be, and they should target 2,300 milligrams or less, especially if they don't have these multiple days of continuous sweating, 90 minutes plus. Cut back on the packets, cut back on the processed foods, even if they're healthy processed foods, etc. Now, if you are somebody who is in this category who has these multiple days of continuous sweating, and if your sodium is not that high, you are going to have to do kind of further testing to determine if electrolyte supplementation is for you. Unfortunately, there's not a guideline for if you, I don't know, work out for 2 hours 3 times a week, you should take electrolyte supplementation. We don't have that type of guideline. What you're trying to figure out is whether or not you are losing enough electrolytes to lead to worse performance. And basically what you'll have to do is you're going to have to test whatever performance is that you're looking for a better outcome, and you know that you sweat a lot, take a certain amount of the electrolytes and water as you're, I don't know, running for 2 hours or rowing for 2 hours, and see if your performance is better with that electrolyte and water supplementation versus just drinking to thirst during that effort. Now, I think the assumption is, well, of course they're going to be better off because they lost a lot of sweat and electrolytes doing that very long session. And what's interesting here, and this is what we talked about in one of the electrolyte podcasts, is sometimes we find that people have better performance when they're slightly more dehydrated. This was like these marathoners who actually ended up winning the marathon when they were greater than, let's say, 5% dehydration. And that's because they were lighter. They are running with less water. And so there's this assumption that people need to be 0% dehydration for best performance, when in reality, we don't actually see that play out. And so this is why it's not just, okay, I'm somebody who sweats a lot and exercises a lot. You actually have to go through, okay, this is the duration, an event that I want to get better at. Now I'm going to take this many electrolytes and this much water, and I'm going to compare it to me just drinking to thirst or just drinking water and see which outcome is better. And you might actually find out that being slightly dehydrated, of course, I'm not recommending severely dehydrated, but slightly dehydrated actually leads to better performance. And that all of us just chugging more and more electrolytes either might be pushing some of us just high in sodium and in the health risks we discuss, or for our athletes might actually just be making us heavier and leading to a worse performance outcome.
Got it. All right. Anything else on supplementation of electrolytes worth mentioning before we get out of here? Do we nail it?
I think we nailed it. I think that people will often say, I like the taste, you know, or like, it's more, I feel better is what I hear after I've had the supplement packet, right, with my water. And it's just like, yeah, you like the taste. There's a little bit of sweetness to it. We tend to like salt. Like, that's why you like it. That's why you, quote, feel better. It's not necessarily because you were dehydrated.
Yeah. And before all the electrolyte supplementation, that's pretty much what made Gatorade a multi-billion-dollar company.
Totally.
Right?
Totally. And that does have some sodium in it, but still, it's like people like the taste of flavors more than they don't.
Take it from my 5-year-old. Orange Gatorade is the best.
Yes.
Thank you, Z. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening, for your reviews and your ratings. They do help new folks find the show. So if you haven't reviewed and rated the show on Apple Podcasts, we would appreciate it. Do make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening and watching so you don't miss another episode. And EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.